Hello and welcome. My name is Marissa Reckman, CEO at AGAT Labs, and I'm very pleased to be here with you today to go over our Indigenous Relations panel for our 2022 AGAT Tech Talks. This, we feel, is one of the most important conversations that we're going to be having for the Tech Talks, and what we hope to be the launch of an important conversation throughout the rest of the year and years to come across our network and throughout all of the communities that we work within AGAT and our foundation. I'm very, very pleased to be joined here today by three esteemed panelists. Two here locally with me in our auditorium here in Calgary, Alberta, and one joining us from Thunder Bay, Ontario. So I would like to welcome Steve Saddleback here with us today, the Director of the National Energy Business Centre of Excellence for the Indian Resources Council of Canada. Thank you, Steve, for joining us today.
Thank you.
And as well as Lawrence Gervais, who is President of the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. Thank you, Lawrence, for being here with us.
Thank you.
And live from Thunder Bay, Ontario, which is also my hometown and a little piece of my heart, I'd like to recognize Edmund Collins, who is the Manager of Indigenous Relations at Englobe. Hi, Ed.
Good afternoon, everybody.
We also had one panelist, Dale Swampy, who's president of the National Coalition of Chiefs, who was set to set the stage with us today, but he was unable to be here. So we will be looking at another date to have him joined here live on stage so we can continue the discussion with him. Now, before we get into a bit of your experience and expertise in the conversation itself, we want to start off with the land acknowledgement. And of course, we're here in Calgary, here in Thunder Bay, but this is going to be broadcast all across Canada, so we certainly want to recognize the land acknowledgement. So I'm going to pass it over to Steve, yourself, to start us off, and then Lawrence and Ed can add in some more comments for us all.
Absolutely, thank you, Marissa, and thank you. And absolutely, if we can, we'll do this jointly, and as we're all joining from different areas, and so I'd like to acknowledge, that we're all gathered here virtually here today, as that we all joined from different parts of the province online and everything. We are hosting this event here in Treaty 7 in Mohkinstsis, and also known as the City of Calgary, which is home to Blackfoot Confederacy, the Tsuut'ina, Kainai, the Stoney Nakoda people, Siksika, as well as many other nations, including Métis, also home to Métis Region 3. We'd just like to welcome you here today, and from wherever you're joining from, is that we'd ask is that if you could take a minute, just maybe close your eyes for a quick second, and think about the land and think about the history and the strength that and all of those lives that have touched that land and have been fundamental in the formation of not only of where we are joining us from today, but also in our families. Is our connection to the land, is that to be thankful for that, and to also think about an opportunity for us to be able to also take that time in that land acknowledgement, but to ask ourselves is, how can we move that now into action? Is there something that we can do in a tiny little step to reach out to our Indigenous communities, be it First Nations land, our partners, businesses, Métis Nations, etc., in terms of being able to increase and build on that strength and build those new relations. So I'll pass it on to our fellow panelists here to assist us with our land acknowledgement. And would you like to add?
No, I think that's a great, Steve, what you just said, and I think we forgot Piikani. And
absolutely,
but sorely, definitely how this southern Alberta, where we are today, and Calgary specific, and Mohkinstsis, and we called it Otasquini, and it's a bit different term, but definitely here on the land, and what it speaks to is what it says in those land acknowledgements. But
and our friend online here today from
Yeah, I would just like to say, I want to say, Miigwech, thank you very much for allowing me onto your traditional territory in this way. So I just want to say Miigwech to that, and yeah.
Thank you.
Well, thank you all. Like I said, I think this really is one of the most important conversations that we're going to have at the Tech Talks, and we've been very lucky that you've all been able to join us together and to start this conversation off. So I'm going to pass this back over to each of you just to take us through a little kind of overview of your experience, how you got here, who you are, for all of the viewers, and then we'll go into some of the key discussions that we want to cover today.
That sounds great.
All right, Steve, kick us off.
Absolutely. So, I'm in my role as the director of the Business Center at Indian Resource Council. We're involved with the advocacy of and work on behalf of about 170 First Nations from across Canada, and looking at responsible energy development. We're involved in all aspects, oil and gas, as well as alternatives, renewables, etc. In my role within the Business Center, it's about building capacity and looking at the challenges, but really focusing on those opportunities that exist within First Nations. Looking at, we're having a lot of talks in and around things like reconciliation, and we recognize the social challenges that exist out there, things like clean drinking water. How can we utilize an energy be a form and a conduit of economic reconciliation to be able to build up, to build up communities, to be able to go in there and actively be engaged in those kind of solutions within their own community. We've had a lot of challenges in terms of those past relationships with the government. That being said, let's focus on solutions, and IRC is really looking at that as the laws, regulations, economic development, and building capacity with our First Nations and industry.
Thank you, Steve. Lawrence.
Lawrence, being Lawrence and who I am, I have many titles, but regional president is the big one. And certainly, outlining that you represent a certain, amount of people, and what those interests are, what their, employment, education, training, research, or programs that we have that we can offer at the M&A, as well as housing and certainly business development and economic development. And that's where we're kind of moving towards now as a Métis Nation. We've only been officially, recognized in terms of what Daniel's done to Canada, and now Canada's response, and knowing that they had a fiduciary responsibility. But that includes access to more things that we can do now. So, we're building up our partnership as best we can. A lot of us have been hidden amongst our community and even in industry, and now them are starting to come back to the nation to work for us. So they're giving us opportunities there too. And then hopefully one day we can sit down with Steve and really sit down, maybe form some type of a partnership or relationship moving forward. And I think that's what the Métis Nation is doing. They're progressing, they're growing. We're one of the fastest growing populations. Not because we're all virile individuals, it's just certainly more people are identifying, right?
Yes.
And certainly that leads to more doors opening, and that it's a wonderful opportunity to sit here with you guys and discuss where everybody's at and where we're going to move ahead and how we can support AGAT Foundation and my other role is I sit on the executive for the province. I'm the treasurer for the M&A, as well as my portfolio is education, training, and research. So anything Rupert's Land Institute related, that's myself. So
wonderful, thank you, Lawrence. Awesome. And Ed, over to you.
All right, so as manager of Indigenous relations for Englobe, my job basically is to foster a relationship between industry, Englobe, and our First Nations partners that we work with. My duties were basically just on Ontario, but now it's getting coast to coast to coast as our Englobe is getting a little stronger now. But again, my job is to make sure that we do it in a proper, respectful manner when we go to communities. Before I started with this position, I was manager of economic development for our First Nation for almost 15 years. And I've seen industry come into communities, and I'm not saying being disrespectful, but not knowing the culture. And so it made it a lot tougher for a lot of industry to come in, talk to us, work with us, partner with us. So now that I'm working on the other side of the river, so to speak, I could help that. I could help those stories and kind of work with our staff to understand when they go to communities that, for example, we brought forward the land acknowledgement, how important that is, how important it is when we smudge, how important it is that when we speak to elders. Those are very important stories that we have to tell, our industry, and it kind of helps, bring jobs and creations.
Absolutely. Thank you, Ed. Well, I'm growing up in Thunder Bay as a young child. I would definitely see the discussions about the relations between the First Nation communities and the city and the citizens, and you could see it firsthand. And I don't think that I was given enough opportunity when I was young in our schooling system at that time to really understand the history across Canada. I just finished that U of A course, and that was a very eye-opening experience for me to understand, these are items that I should have been raised with as a child and known as a child. And so I understand a lot of that's changing. But the whole idea of Indigenous relations throughout my lifetime, I think, has very much changed in my mindset. And I finally realized, like you said, Steve, we all have a place and a piece in this, and we all need to be trying to work towards this. And we can't just look at it like a checkbox on a piece of paper. Mm-hmm. So, going back to each of you, what does Indigenous relations, that idea, that theme or topic, what does that mean to you and the individuals that you represent? And actually, let's switch it up this way. Why don't we go back to Ed, and then we'll come back to these guys.
Sounds good. Yeah, so I think it helps build partnerships between Indigenous communities, organizations, industry, and other levels of government. I always say this, and it's education is a key in understanding. And as my role, like I said earlier, that's what I try to explain to our industry, is our stories kind of thing. So, sharing that culture with other people, it helps. It helps us understand and helps us work together. So I think that's basically,
Thanks, Ed.
Yep.
Lawrence, how about for yourself?
Well, I think it starts with the understanding and education piece, right? Because, I look to the government as somebody who really instilled a lot of policies that worked against First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people across this country, and really kept the curriculum, the real true curriculum, out of the schools.
Yeah.
And we're seeing that. And that's why it's so important for us now to have Indigenous relations, those bridge people that can bridge between two communities, to be able to sit there and make people understand, make them feel comfortable, give them a proper sort of guidance, or I wouldn't say education, but a guidance on how they work with Indigenous communities. And I think that's very, very valuable, those people right now, because they're trying to regain what we've lost in the past and give society and industry a real knowledge so they can move forward. Right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and I guess in the wise words of a couple of good friends of mine and myself, ditto. No, absolutely. What the gentlemen are saying here is that when I look at the role of Indigenous relations and the opportunity to provide education in there, a little bit of my background: I'm a former residential school attendee and also a day school attendee. So, I've got a lot of folks within the general public, and there's often this belief of this happened generations and generations ago. We have these discussions today in terms of what does reconciliation look like, and some folks call these discoveries, and I go, no, they're not discoveries. It's recoveries. We've known about this, so it is that education that we've always known about from within our Indigenous communities, but it just hasn't been written in the textbooks. It wasn't shared. So I was a bit of a, I guess, radical, if you will, and when I was going through the traditional education system, and I was often that kid who was sent back to the principal's office. My social studies teachers loved me. Why? Because I would say to them, and I would read in the book, and we'd go over the Indigenous communities and our Indigenous communities and the history in there, and I would say, "Excuse me, miss, thank you for sharing that with us, but I just wanted to let you know there's some inaccuracies in the story." And as a grade 9, grade 10, grade 11, grade 12, so on and so forth student, my answer back from the front would be, "Well, did you write this book? Are you an expert in this?" And I said, "No, miss, I didn't. But the stories that I'm sharing with you now, and those inaccuracies and how I'm trying to share them with you, were entrusted to us from our elders."
Yeah.
So those stories aren't contained within here. This is just simply one version of that. Well, Mr. Saddleback, thank you very much for that. Please go to the principal's office. Okay, thank you very much. I'll see you tomorrow. And you'd show up tomorrow and then the same thing, and it'd be like, go over and talk about those stories again. Excuse me, miss. Off to the principal's office and call on the phone and, talk with the parents. But there were some challenges within that, is that, thank you for bringing that to light, is that Indigenous relations is really looking at, a building block in that in this whole entire system, if you will, of how can we look at things like our education system, where it's nobody's fault. It's not about pointing fingers or anything, but here's an opportunity for us to be able to build on looking at how do we change the way that we've done things in the past.
Yeah.
And it's not about, pointing fingers and saying, oh, well, you didn't learn this in school and how, no. It just simply was, well, let's acknowledge that didn't happen. Now, how can we change that? And how do we bring that information to light? So courses like that one at the University of Alberta have been fundamental in having a shift in our culture and understanding the true history of Canada, which can be challenging in many ways, but ultimately going, let's acknowledge that and let's figure out a way to build a positive future for us all.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think like you each kind of said it, it really starts with that knowledge and education in some capacity, and not expecting that is where it ends either, right? That's the start of it, and then it's up to us to act. And you're so right, Steve. I think there's this misconception amongst Canadians thinking this is the history, right? This happened so long ago. Like, aren't we over it by now? And it didn't happen that long ago. And the history, I mean, if people really know the full history and the true stories and spend the time, you realize, it's not that easy to just get over when we're not putting in the work to getting over, and we just haven't been on the right path, right?
100%.
So one of the things, oh yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, I just want to add that it amazes me that so I do cultural training within our industry here, and it amazes me every time I do it. I always get that. Well, how come this wasn't? How come we weren't taught this in school?
Yeah.
And it amazes me that nobody seems to understand or seems to know what's going on or what went on or what's still going on, kind of thing. So I think things like this talk right now helps people understand, helps the non-Aboriginal people understand what we've been through, what we're going through, what we have been through, and the hurdles that we had to do. So I have to say miigwech for allowing us to do this. So.
Well, I'm tremendously thankful to each of you for taking part in this conversation. So one of the things that I've really loved, and again, back in time from when I was back home in Thunder Bay to moving out here, going through the course, just being able to foster relationships, I really love how we are taught through stories and learnings, like, these lessons that we can actually grow with through life. So, in the next section, I wanted to ask each of you if there was a sharing story that you wanted to put forward about something that has been kind of a monumental point in your career, your life, where you felt like this was an example of those relations working well, us being successful and being able to fostering the advancement of reconciliation or just moving the conversation forward. Lawrence, do you want to start this one off and see if there's something?
Well, I mean, when you talk about success, I mean, for us, and we look at our history as Métis people, back to the fur trade and how we were blending into the families, and a lot of it was for survival. Because without the Aboriginal women, we wouldn't have been able to, those European men would never been able to travel any further.
Yeah.
Right? So they needed to form those kinship. And certainly with the chiefs working back in those days, they established that relationship. But then the business side started coming in. Then they would honor just that company over that company. So we hear a lot of stories about that.
Yeah.
But we always focus on the family connection because that's the most success we have. as Indigenous people. I feel anyways, and Métis people, for, specifically, is, we honor our Aboriginal women because they were the ones that were the true matriarchs in our community. And we have a lot of women leaders in our community too, even nowadays. And it's partly because of that. And my mother, I consider her a matriarch in our community. She's known as an elder where she lives now, but certainly I think that's where the real true success for us, because they were the ones that really pioneered. I shouldn't say that word either, because that's a colonial term, but the ones that really made those individuals survive even further through the winter.
Yeah, it was amazing, and I did appreciate, as I was going through some of these learnings and some of that coursework, just that strong focus and the respect for the matriarchs and the women across, whether it was the Métis women or First Nations or Inuit. It just seemed like, there's so much that we could be learning across all communities across Canada, and what works really well.
Yeah.
Steve.
Yeah, I think if I would use an example that we're kind of working on right now, it would be, so the federal government, in response to the COVID-19 and the challenges that we're all facing, we're looking at a jobs creation initiative. So how do we build this jobs creation initiative? And they created they transferred $1.7 billion to the Western Canada, looking at how do we support the energy industry, an industry that has seen some challenges in the past, but is currently, like everyone else, was facing some real struggles. Out of that, the site rehabilitation program was focused on the reclamation and remediation of inactive and abandoned wells in the province, so immature wells. So it's end of life cycle projects, and we saw a lot of that activity happening in the province of Alberta. There was $1 billion that was put towards this activity. Indigenous communities weren't involved at the outset. So we had a lot of challenges in terms of that. It was going, well, wait a minute. There's just been $1 billion that is put towards cleaning up inactive wells. Indigenous communities have been, be it First Nations or Métis, have been talking about how do we live in balance with economic development and our environment since time immemorial. That's at the foundation of our being, right? And then it's going, how do we ensure that we were involved in the entire process, ensuring that we weren't being left on the outside? So we did a lot of advocating, and we're finally got a message through. And I go kudos to our provincial government in putting a set aside, creating the First Nations. We call it the First Nations program within period 6, but it's actually it's referred to as the SRP period 6 SRP program.
Yeah.
Apologies for that. And
it's a long, lengthy time.
A big acronym in trying to get this information all out there. But out of that, we were successful in getting an allocation of $85 million to First Nations lands, $15 million to Métis settlements, and looking at job creation programs.
Yeah.
The federal government and the provincial government were acknowledged that Indigenous communities and all of our Indigenous nations as a whole need to be involved in every step of the way. Yeah. So, this program has since gone on to create the return. I was talking with Minister Wilkinson, and I was able to give him the numbers. Their investment was giving a 40 times ROI.
Isn't that incredible?
Our Indigenous communities are good investment.
Yeah.
Here's an opportunity for Indigenous communities to not only create jobs, not just simply labor, we need our labor folks, but create new companies, CEOs, as well as joint ventures with large corporations. And then this is, we've seen the effects of it. And now we're coming to, this program will sunset at the end of this year. We're having discussions on to how do we extend this program, not only on First Nations, but in Métis Nations. And we are having a discussion this morning on that.
Yeah.
So I'm really excited about those kind of initiatives of how can we look at ways of collaboration, not just First Nations, not just Métis settlement, not just industry, because when it comes down to it, we're all in this together.
Yeah.
And one of the a good gentleman, had just given me a little word of advice, and he said, if you want to, we're often caught in the center of our universe. If we recognize that the Earth is just a big spaceship, and we're all the astronauts, and we're all together on this spaceship, we'll be able to understand that. Well, let's take away a lot of this. Is recognize we're in this together. And we need to be able to collaborate better and imagine the future that we can create.
Yeah, that's a really good way of saying it. And actually, a lot of that, a lot of it ties into. So we taped a panel interview on the environmental industry across Canada as well. And we had Stacey Thigason, who I know that you're familiar with, Steve, having sat on some of the groups together. And I've been a part of that working group for the site rehabilitation program with ESA as well. And I know how much that program has meant to the advancement in these areas. And it's been, very foundational in setting some sustainable opportunities, I think, for the Indigenous communities, and opportunities that that ROI will just keep going because it's so incredibly needed right now. One of the things we talked about on that panel was the fact that so many individuals have left the industry when it comes to the expertise that we previously had, and now we're desperate for hands. And when I mean leaving the industry, I'm focused right now on the environment, right? And so the training that you've done that will continue to grandfather and feed into the reclamation or remediation tied to the energy industry, but it can also expand into reclamation and remedial efforts of any industry across Canada. We talked about the fact that if you're a dry cleaner or a chemical manufacturing plant, or if you're an automotive manufacturing plant, there's always going to be some level of environmental work that needs to be required, right? Whether it's emissions or soil and water contamination. So those skill sets will hopefully take those individuals into their lifetime where they can continue to travel that path, right? And so important.
100%.
Ed, what about yourself?
Yeah, so I'm not sure if you're aware of this in your area, but in Ontario, we had a it's still going on right now, but an east-west tie transmission line. It was a 450 kilometer transmission line running from Wawa to Thunder Bay. What had happened when they first started it, the chiefs got together from the 6 First Nations that were approximate First Nations. How can we benefit? How can we work with industry on this? So they established what was called Supercom, and Supercom was the 6 First Nations, the traditional that were along this east-west transmission line, and we all worked together for a common goal for education, jobs, and training for the First Nations. So these are the 6 First Nations that never worked together before in anything like this, but I think it was very successful. We worked with, like I said, the 6 First Nations, worked with another couple First Nations, the Métis Nation, and also the municipalities in this area, and we made sure that jobs were here, that training was here, and it was amazing success. We worked with the colleges here in Thunder Bay here. We trained a lot of the First Nations. Some of them didn't even have licenses. So we got them a license so they could, work in industry and would drive vehicles, et cetera, et cetera. So, there's grounds, linesmen, et cetera, et cetera. So it was a very successful partnership with the 6 First Nations. It was a partnership with the Métis. It was a partnership with the with industry, and surrounding area. So I think that was a very successful way for fostering that relationship between industry, First Nations. So
Thank you.
Yeah. And maybe I did not really understand the question, but maybe I should actually outline some success we have actually in the region. And one of those big successes we have is, we got the one of the main contracts for Springbank, for the Springbank Dam. And that is really a protection mechanism. So if there's another flood, we now have a dam here just outside of Calgary that will certainly create a reservoir of water and hopefully filter that away from the city. So that was a big success for us. But out of that too, we've gotten 2 licenses for satellites up to do satellite monitoring. So now we can do wildfire management as well as any mitigation for floods, as well as if there's mines that need certainly a viewpoint from the space, we can actually get to a 3 by meter by 3 by meter picture at any time of the year, right? So
Wow.
now we have those successes in place, and certainly our region is moving towards those sort of protection for environment, those sort of initiatives, and I think those are very valuable projects, even to industry.
Yeah, well, and there's so much discussion across Canada, and again, part of our environmental panel focused on this as well too. And I think a couple of you have said this, right? There's a balance there between what we can drive in the economy and how our resources tie into that, but how we can protect and preserve and be respectful of the environment, right? There is a balance there, and I think Canada has some incredibly bright minds and talent and resources to understand how to do this. And certainly when we're talking about the Indigenous communities, I mean, those have always been the true stewards of the land, right? That's where I think the understanding of that connection between body and the actual land and Mother Earth kind of comes into play. And the more that we can involve that as pieces of it, I think the better served and the better opportunities will be to actually find that balance, instead of just fighting against it the entire time and really not moving ahead anywhere. And so I think, in all of the successes and all of the things that you guys are saying, one of the things it comes down to is trying to create what feels like value for individuals, right? And being able to give them the opportunity to succeed and to be able to do that for a long time. So do you guys want to talk a little bit about how you feel, when you see the opportunities come forward, whether it's education or job creation, how does that change what you're seeing in the communities? And whether it's First Nations, Métis, how do you see that positively influence the communities themselves?
Oh, it's definitely multi-generational. It has a large impact. Many of our First Nations people had to choose between an education and their status, and which has ultimately led to a number of different court decisions and cases. And one, if I would almost refer that, or if we can just all kind of step back for a quick second, and those that are joining us and watching this virtually from wherever you may be, we'll often look at it and go, oh, well, that individual lost it, or that community lost it. Let's just hold up a mirror for a quick second. This is a loss that we all share in. We lose those lives that either are A, no longer here with us, or else B, didn't have that opportunity to go to school. Maybe somebody, we lose those doctors, those lawyers, those accountants, whatever. That's something we collectively share as a society. So this is something when I look at it, and when we look at things like education is fundamental within our community. I kind of chuckle because I'm so thankful for our elders and the opportunity for me to even have. I was sitting in ceremony with my grandfather Nimuslim last week, but they're always sharing stories with us, and they're teaching you, and you don't even realize it. Yeah. They're telling you a story, and you don't even realize. When you go back and you visit that story a number of different times, there's different pieces in that will stick out, and I'll have an aha moment. So education for us is fundamental. It's not necessarily done in some of the traditional manners, reading a book or anything like that, but sharing in that, and you can really see that you're able to deliver messages. You're able to change the course of the path of a lot of folks. For myself, I was like any other kid out there. I was, that rebellious teenager who was into, hey, cars and having fun and all of this kind of stuff. And it's been through those guidance and those, a number of different folks. This was never a me thing. I have to acknowledge all of those influences in my life. And I was talking with one of my mentors earlier today, And those are shaped our communities and shape us as individuals. So how can we have a role to play in that larger picture? It's never about us. It's always about everyone else.
Yeah, well said. Lawrence, do you have some comments about how you've seen potentially some of these opportunities change the landscape of the individuals that are in your region?
I definitely, our poverty levels are very high, and certainly, I'm sure that in First Nations is, the norm I think is about 11%. We're about 23, and this is an urban stat, and I think First Nations around 27, right? So yeah, if the more access we have to actually pulling our families out of those poverty levels, then we're able to achieve those successes. And you are starting to see it the more that the government's responding, industry is responding, and they're opening that door. Then now we can encourage those younger people to, get educated. Here's a Métis Scholar Award for you. Go to school, get to your 4th level, get that work experience, and then that's how it grows, right? And it transfers down pretty quick to a community.
Yeah, absolutely. Ed?
Yeah, well, job creations and community is amazing. Growing up, when I was applying for jobs and getting doors slammed in my face, and I don't know how many times I heard, "Oh, you're from the reserve." Yeah, we're not well looking right now. I've heard that, hundreds of thousands of times growing up. Now, knowing now that our communities are starting to get those jobs, getting those education, I just love it. It's just crazy. It's like I said, it just growing up in that situation, and getting even if you get a job, you're and I don't mean this to be disrespectful to anybody out there. Trust me, those ditch digger jobs. And again, my dad was a ditch digger. He worked with Ministry of Transportation. He worked digging the ditches, right? He did that. I did that as well. But now that our members are getting that education, they become CEOs. They're sitting, at the big table. They're no longer at the kids' table at Thanksgiving. They're eating with the big adults now. So I'm happy that education and job creation is just rampant in the communities, and it's just getting major opportunities for our community members.
Yeah, I can absolutely appreciate those comments as well too. Again, going back to my youth growing up in Thunder Bay, I see, and then I do a lot of traveling across Canada in this role, and because we have locations all over. But Thunder Bay, I think, was one of the areas that I saw some of those relationships the most fractured at certain points of my life, right? And yet you'd still hear people say, no, I don't think that racism exists, or I don't really think that there's a problem. I think that we're doing fine. And I thought, how can you miss that? If you can say that, you're at a very privileged point in life, and you should be thankful of the fact that you have this privilege. And I've recognized as I've got older that I'm privileged, right? And if I woke up in a different body tomorrow as the exact same person that what I went to sleep with tonight, my life might be different in terms of how people respond to me tomorrow. And that seems so unfair, but that's the reality, right? And that's what we have to continue to change and shape and do better on. But I think sometimes it's the people who don't have to experience that, not sometimes, most of the time, it's the people that don't experience that are blind to it, right? Because you're not forced for that to be your reality. You can be blind and pretend that it's something different, right?
Mm-hmm. I think if you look at it another way, so when I was growing up, school, grade 7, grade 8, one of my teachers said, "You're just going to be another drunken Indian on the streets. So why are you here? Why are you bothering?"
Oh my God.
And I could have took that, and I could have been one of those drunken Indians, quote unquote, that, as he said, living on the streets. But I took that a different way, and I kind of worked my way to where I am now. So were those harsh words? Yes. Yeah. But it opened my eyes. So those are the things that happen to a lot of the First Nations, and getting that education, made me who I am today. So, should I thank him? I don't know.
And I'm with you Ed, on that. You know, I shared the same experience. I was a grade 4 teacher, and I was pulled into the principal's office, and they pulled out the strap and they smashed my hands and beat me till I was crying. And then the principal looked at me, and she was a big lady, and she said, "You're never going to amount to anything in your life." And so we hold those in there, and you can absolutely let those kind of messages destroy you. I use that as fuel every day. I sit there and I go, hey, you know what? I'm sitting there with a daughter who has a rare genetic syndrome where she's literally changing the book and writing medical journals, and we're doing DNA research, we're doing foundation work and everything like that. So it's ultimately how can we respond to those? And you know, gentlemen like Ed are their prime example of you know, being able to take what is it can be a tough and challenging situation and turn it into a positive. So
Yeah, and
you know, hats off to you, Ed.
And I think that's what's so important, right, is as we open these conversations and dialogue and people can hear, and individuals that might still be living that experience right now, they can hear those stories and see, okay, you're right, I could take it this way and I could allow that to you know, push me on a path of self-destruction, or I can use this as fuel to show and prove why that isn't the case. But it really is important to be able to see that other individuals have been able to use that in a positive manner to build and grow as well too, right? To give individuals that kind of reassurance, like it's possible and I can keep going and keep doing it, right? And going back to your comments, Lawrence, about the fact that the fastest growing population, I mean, that in itself, you look at that and continue to expand that out into the future. And I think everybody should be cognizant of the fact that the dynamics can shift very quickly when we're talking about the size of the planet that it is right now, right? And someday, you know, what might feel like the minority now might not be the minority, and what feels the majority, like there's just all of these shifts that can happen. And I think what I hope is that as time goes on, there will always be an underlying amount of respect, but if we don't work on it now, we can't expect it later on, right?
Yeah. I mean, one of the reasons why we're one of the fastest too is because our families remained hidden for so long.
Yes.
Is because of the fear of discrimination, because they looked at the residential schools and they were seeing what was happening there. So the mothers taught their kids, you don't speak your language outside this house. You don't identify as Aboriginal because this will happen to you, right? And now we're coming out of the woodwork because we're just being found again. We're reawakening ourselves, and our grandparents aren't telling us that anymore, right? And that's why we're a little bit growing a little bit quicker.
Yeah, and I think it's so beautiful to see. I still think in Canada, as educated as we are, and as, you know, first world country, we're still missing so much, right? I still come across individuals that don't understand what the difference between, you know, they use the term First Nation and Métis absolutely interchangeably and don't actually understand any of the differences, right? And I think you said it before, Steve, right? It's no one's fault necessarily because, again, we did a poor job with education through the years, but there are excellent resources out there now that can help individuals if you're open to putting in the time and the effort and the work, right? And just learning, just being open to listening and opening to learning.
Yeah, and our First Nations Métis communities need to sat down, our families, we need to rediscover ourselves too. And that's, hopefully we'll get to that safe place again, because government and everybody else did a very good job of creating that divide, right? And certainly our families need to gather again at some point. And they probably will, you know, and that's the most important thing to say. But how do we do it as industry people is maybe forming those relationships now.
Yeah. They were really good at trying to do this. For me, I always do this. I try to do my best to go, you know, it's not First Nations things, it's not, you know, it's neither First Nation, Métis or anything. I go, you know, back to that analogy of that spaceship model, and and going, we're all here, we all have a tie-in. It's about ultimately, oh, where are you from? Tell me a little bit more. Ultimately about 99% of the stuff we're aligned with. There might be some small, minute little things, but those might just be a cultural practice. Example, for those that are listening in, how many, in your head, how many First Nations are there in Canada? Okay, do you think they're all homogeneous? Do you think we all get along?
Yeah.
Do you think we all practice the same culture? How many dialects do you think they have? Is that in First Nations, Métis, from across Turtle Island, we're very unique in many ways, but ultimately it's about back to that collaboration and that working together. We've had trading, our elders often share stories in terms of our trading paths and talking about how we used to trade with the Indigenous communities down in South America. And they could tie that back hundreds of years, way before Canada was ever even a blip on somebody's mind. And they're talking about these relationships and the cultivation and the agriculture and all of the the economic prosperity that existed here. And Indigenous communities were a part of that. So in terms of, there's a belief that sometimes that Indigenous communities are this, that we're an infant growing into this. No. We've been doing this. We've been trading since time immemorial.
Yep.
Canada was founded on that trade.
Yes.
Métis Nations and First Nations walked hand in hand in terms of ensuring that happened here. So it's recognizing, that we've all had a role to play in the formation and the prosperity of this young country, and that's going to continue to grow. So I'm really excited about that future and trying to go absolutely sitting down and breaking bread and talking and being able to share a meal and just share our history and about, hey, how can we collaborate going forward? Back to this site rehab program that we were working on. A lot of folks are saying, and if would try to drive a wedge in between First Nations and Métis settlements. My thing was always going, can we work together?
Yeah.
Can you guys come and help us out? Because
Yeah.
we might not have the capacity in this role on our nation, and maybe we have some piece of equipment or something you guys could use. Let's
Yeah.
do that together.
Yeah.
So if we do that approach, the future is bright, and that's for us all, for not only Indigenous people but non-Indigenous people as well.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that in too many areas of our life now, the politics comes into play, and it fosters this quick divide, right? It feels like you can only be on one side of that line, and there's no middle ground, right? If you are supportive or believe in one thing, then you are absolutely against something on the other side. And like you said, I think for the most part, we're all in that central ground where we're close to what we all want. We might envision it different ways, we might have different thoughts, but at the end of the day, a lot of the goals across Canada are very similar, and there is some harmony there that we can get to if we just start working together. And I think, when we talk again about the Indigenous relations, the role of politics has not been able to, and I'm not being, this is apolitical in saying, because it's the role across all politics that just has obviously not got us to where we need to be, right? The fact that there would still be communities that don't have clean drinking water is just, in Canada, is, just mind-boggling, because it's not that we don't know how to do it. It's not that the technology doesn't exist. It's not that there's no hindrance except for the fact that that politics has not been able to agree on a way to accomplish it, when that it should be a no-brainer, right? It should be here's the goal. People have clean water in Canada. That's a standard. Somebody gets it done, and we move, and yet we just keep talking circles around it. And the only time it seems to be a key factor is when we're going into an election year, right? And it ramps back up, and there's all these promises made, and then we get out of an election year, and it's like, oh, well, it was exciting for a bit, and now we're back into it, right? So in terms of future hopes and recommendations that you each have. I mean, there's no doubt that there's a lot of work to be done, and sometimes I think that can feel overwhelming to a lot of people. So do you each have some recommendations or what you would view as a hope for the future that you want to share? And that can be on any side of the coin or conversation, but you know, if you were looking in your optimistic bubble of how you think that we can start to do better, what does that look like to you? Ed, do you want to go?
I can go. I'll go first.
We haven't heard from Ed for a while.
Sitting in the corner here. I think, you know, the 94 calls to action, you know, section 52, section 92 of the, you know, has to be looked at. And there's got to be education. Education is a must out there. And it's got to be meaningful and respectful manner. I think that has to happen for us to move forward. You know, I said it earlier, education is the key, right? Things like this, working together, showing our stories kind of thing, right? I do cultural training as well, and I said it earlier, and you know, showing what a smudge is, you know, that kind of helps bridge that divide, you know, that we're not just those people sitting in the corner are wanting to take your jobs away or take your, you know, get rid of, you know, that we're going to demand everything. So I think working together and, you know, reconciliation and you know, education is basically the key to this.
Yeah. Well, on that note, actually, Ed, do you want to take just a couple moments to tell us and the viewers what you've got behind you as your backdrop, because that ties in a little bit to the idea that we can educate and share some of that.
Definitely. So when I do my training, and there's no wrong way to do it. You know, First Nations out there got many ways to do it. So when I do it, we do a smudge, and we use our 4 medicines that we either individually or put into this air, and it's not to heal your COVID, it's not heal your cancer, it's there to heal your heart, your mind, your soul. And I tell people that when you're smudging, you know, you bring the smoke toward you, and it helps you make your day a better day. Yeah. So that's what a smudge is, and it helps and you know, I do it in our office every once in a while, and people request it. Non-Aboriginal people, I don't like using the word white people, I can't stand that word. It angers me when people use that word. But non-Aboriginal people in our office request a lot of times a smudge, and that's what that is behind me. And I take pride, and it's a respectful way of just making your day a good day.
Yeah, so wonderful. Thank you for that. I think the first time I was exposed to that was actually my dad back in Thunder Bay, because he's done a lot of work with the First Nations communities. He owned a advertising and marketing agency, and so they did a lot of work together, and again, going back to, you know, learning about the cultures and traditions and understanding how to respectfully do business with each other, it was quite a journey. And so he had his first smudging ceremony, and I now in my office have this beautiful eagle feather arrow that he passed down to me from one of the First Nations communities. He's had it for years, and he finally said, okay, it's time for me to pass this on to you. It'll help you show the way. And I have it in my office there, hoping that, you know, it helps with the decisions that we're making and keeping us on the right path and keeping us safe and protected. And but so many different things to share within the culture and the symbolism and the respect. So Lawrence, what about yourself? Hopes for the future, recommendations?
Well, I'm on what Ed is talking about, meaningful engagements, meaningful relationships, and then having those meaningful access to opportunities for your company. Yeah. You know, and I think when you do all 3 of those things, first off, you're on a definite right path, I think, in reconciliation. And if you develop an Indigenous policy, make sure you have Indigenous input. Yeah. Right, and that's very, very important.
Yeah, definitely well said. Because I know for your region as well too, there was just recently some things in the news with you know, ongoings in the city where a bit of the mark was missed on engagement and yes. That and I think at the end of the day, maybe it's, you know, even if you feel like you've done a good job and you've meaningfully engaged, if you're being told that you haven't, then it's the time again to listen and realize like we've got to take this as a learning and we've got to do better. And you're right, it's more about you can't just be putting in policies without actually engaging on those policies, because that also misses the mark.
Yes.
Yeah. Steve?
I think it was said earlier is putting yourself in that uncomfortable place, but also being okay with being there, is seeing the growth from that is, how do we look as an industry, and especially with the energy industry, a lot of the past has been, oh, well, we just need to go get a permit and then we're going to go and build. Those ways have long gone by the wayside. Recent court decision from Blueberry First Nation, the cumulative effects in terms of, how do we ensure engagement? Gentlemen, we're talking about consultation and ensuring that we do this properly. One of the organizations I'm involved with, we look at building solutions on First Nations lands and Indigenous communities. And in a group of 50 leaders from different companies and everything, after listening to what was being presented, I asked them, how many have been here to a First Nation? 2 hands went up. I said, okay, before you're going to go and build a project for anyone, should we maybe have a discussion with them? And it's great to come up with a concept and conceptualize things and start getting down that path, but somewhere along the lines, we're going to need to be able to have this conversation. So one of my approaches is jump in a vehicle. Let's take the suit off. Let's take our jeans and throw on a jacket. Let's go and visit. Let's just go for a drive. I want to share some of the history and some of that has been entrusted to me as to be able to hold, but it's also my responsibility in holding that information is to pass it on, and through that we're going to be able to grow. So, an example would be wherever we're joining from is that if somebody in the city of Calgary, if a company wanted to come and build a well or a lease in your backyard, you would hope that they would talk to you first rather than just showing up and all of a sudden digging and going, oh, hey, yeah, I got this piece of paper. Hey, don't worry about it. Government said it's good. Here you go. I got my dozer out back. We're just gonna come and tear up your backyard. No hard feelings, Kay. I got a little royalty for you. $5. It's all good. But when you take those kind of steps, you can understand how, regardless of First Nation, just as human beings, is that something's happening to you and impacting you that really hasn't had that consultation. So I really find that industry has come a long way. We still have a long way to go, but it's getting into that uncomfortable place of growth to get an understanding of each community, person, whoever we're dealing with it on that level, and then from there, how do we build a successful long-term multi-generational project? First Nations, Métis, I'm not going to try to speak for anybody, but for us as just fundamentally as people, is yes, we're not looking for a handout. We're looking for a hand up in partnership. And how do we walk and look at that multi-generational impacts in our communities? We want to see that just as much as anybody out there, and we can do that. That can happen. And it's all going to start, sitting around, having a cup of coffee, having a cup of tea, having some water or something along those lines. Let's break bread and let's talk.
Yeah, and I mean, like each of you have talked to, that's why it's so important that individuals like yourselves are in these roles, right? To try and help foster and bridge these discussions and these relationships. And someone like Ed, for you to have come from a situation where you saw what went well with consultation with the First Nations, you saw what went poorly, and now you can use that in your role and your company so that you can, continue to just improve beyond that and not do the faults that you've seen before with other companies come in. I think, this discussion is like, it ties into the idea of like gender equity and some of these other things, right? Where sometimes companies just end up saying, okay, this is something that we've got to do. Like, so to get this contractor to do this work, I've got to have consultation. I've got to make sure that there's diversity on my teams, and and you run through the exercise so quickly, and it totally misses the mark. It's where policy is pushed with somewhat of some good intent, but doesn't actually get the job done, and if anything, it ends up fracturing it, because then those relationships go sour. You realize that there was maybe not necessarily ill intent, but wrongful intent in that, right? And then it's hard to recover from that, and it's hard to gain the trust back because it started off incorrectly at the beginning as well too. So certainly your roles, your work, your involvement is so important, and hopefully we can continue to see that expand. I think one of the things that Dale, hopefully he can join us in another day, and one of the things that he will talk about ties into how important sustainable resource development and energy is to helping to directly work on reserve poverty, trying to lift those poverty lines up to get people to find value in their livelihoods, and that's that is a real concern, obviously. And especially with inflation at 5.1% and just getting more expensive across Canada, it's just getting worse, right? So we do need those economic opportunities to actually create better livelihoods for people, but it's got to be done in the right way, and it has to be done through consultation. And when I worked on the environmental consulting side, and I saw the engagement with traditional knowledge, I mean, it was really eye-opening to understand that you could go to university, you could study environmental science, you can do all of this work in the environmental industry, but you're never going to have the traditional knowledge of the land. And thus, if you're trying to push a project forward and you don't understand that particular grass might be used for these particular medicinal utilizations, or this is what they're using this part of the land for in terms of hunting and fishing, and here's the seasonalities, and again, that's where it all ends up breaking down. So all parts are so important.
Absolutely.
So I know this conversation went really quickly, and we're at the end of time. I'm sure we could sit here and talk for hours and hours and hours, and I would welcome you guys back at any point in time, and I'll let you know when Dale wants to join us again in case you guys want to return for more conversation. The viewers themselves definitely may be reaching out for questions and comments, but I just want to thank you all so much for sharing in this with us today. Again, I think it's one of the most important discussions. I hope we can only just keep it going. And I really hope that we can start to help to support through the foundation to really engage change as we move forward, meaningful conversations, and hopefully a path to reconciliation in future generations for what we can actually see. So thank you to each of you, and we hope to see you again.